There are at least 2,000 children who die of maltreatment each year, and that number is almost certainly an undercount.
I think we all have a tendency to assume that the data that is put out by our federal government or by a public agency is exactly what it is purported to be. Certainly when it comes to child abuse and neglect fatalities, those federal numbers are not real, and we should not be treating them as if they are real, and we can do better.
The death of a child is one of the most tragic events that a community can experience, particularly in cases where the loss feels preventable. When it comes to child welfare, we can understand how accidents happen, but we tend to be far less forgiving of those who fail to do their duty, whether as caregivers or law enforcement. Given this attitude, one might reasonably suppose that the policies governing child welfare in this country and the data supporting them would be some of our most tightly regimented. The surprising truth, however, is that our modern child welfare system is not a single regime at all, but rather a collection of disparate state-run enterprises, each with their own rules, regulations, and definitions, right down to the most fundamental question of what constitutes maltreatment. This last point is particularly important because experts in the field agree that without a uniform understanding of the assumptions underlying the numbers, any nationwide data related to child fatalities from maltreatment becomes extremely difficult to interpret, with severe consequences for our ability to monitor and protect the most vulnerable among us.
Under CAPTA, or the Child Abuse and Prevention Treatment Act, the federal government has always given states a significant amount of discretion to define abuse and neglect, which means that states have very different definitions of maltreatment, very different approaches to reviewing data that would allow them to obtain an accurate count of children who've died due to abuse and neglect. And it means that the data that the states submit to the federal government is incredibly variable.
Why do different states have such different definitions of maltreatment? After all, most crimes that result in death, murder, homicide, manslaughter, are defined in terms of a fairly clear-cut chain of cause and effect. What makes the maltreatment of a child any different? Well, part of the problem is that the behavior we most commonly call maltreatment isn't actually the most common kind.
I think most people think of maltreatment as abuse. Most of the child maltreatment fatalities in this country occur as a result of neglect, though. And neglect can encompass a whole lot of things. It can mean not feeding a child, not giving a child medical care when they obviously need it, leaving a young child, alone for hours or days at a time, leaving a child in the care of someone who is going to do something to hurt that child. So yeah, I think neglect is the definition that people tend to have a lot more trouble with. But I think, a lot of ordinary people really would say that they know that when they see it.
So if they know it when they see it, why isn't it recorded? And why don't we have accurate data? It primarily has to do with the methods used to categorize these deaths. In the U.S., we have vital birth records and vital death records, which are universal across state lines. What isn't universal is the information that is linked to that death record when recording the cause of death. And in those cases where there's some ambiguity in interpreting the circumstantial evidence, the tendency has been to err on the side of leaving it out.
There's always going to be a balance between children's rights, parental rights, and the role of the state in protecting kids. And so I think each state, is working out that balance for themselves. And, they might determine that, if a child died of unsafe sleep, even if the parent was intoxicated and rolled over on them and, accidentally suffocated that child, that shouldn't be categorized as maltreatment because, the parent didn't mean to, or basically that, it was a contributing factor, but it wasn't the factor. And maybe if that parent had just been sleeping, but not intoxicated, it would have happened anyway. But yeah, I think, every state is going to sort of make these determinations for themselves, and they're trying to balance the protection of children against too much government intrusion.
But while these sorts of privacy concerns are legitimate and important to wrestle with, the fact remains that they too often lead to child fatalities being officially labeled as undetermined or categorized solely by the immediate cause of death, which limits our ability to understand how the child came to be in that compromised state to begin with.
It's perfectly possible that a medical examiner would say the cause is undetermined, but sometimes what we're seeing in these medical reports is that there is information which would lead any reasonable person to be able to determine that at least one of the causes has been determined. There's a case in New Mexico a couple of years ago, a child, baby literally fell in between a couch and the wall. But when they did toxicology on the parent, it was clear that the parent was very high at the time. And so, the death could be, undetermined, if you're willing to, I guess, sort of suspend disbelief and not look at the evidence around you. But I think that we need to do a lot more thinking about what are the factors that are leading to these deaths and whether they are really, whether the cause is really undetermined.
One final factor frustrating efforts to reform how we track child maltreatment fatalities is the push among some activists to overhaul the mission of child welfare, reorienting it away from protection and toward a more holistic focus on prevention. While this change is well-intentioned, many child welfare agencies across the country now find their already thin resources stretched even thinner.
I think child welfare agencies are engaged in a huge amount of mission creep. People think that they need to be engaged in promoting child well-being instead of protecting children who are in danger. Many people now talk about how child welfare agencies shouldn't be in the business of protecting children. They should be in the business of promoting family well-being. And I think that that is just an absolutely enormous mission. And it is one that is impossible to fulfill. And I'm not sure that it's the government's role to fulfill it. And I think it makes the job of child welfare agencies harder because they can't focus on the thing that I think should be most important, which is, again, protecting children who are in real danger.
This mission creep is part of the larger political and cultural shift over the last few decades in people's attitudes regarding social justice issues. As a result, people are increasingly hesitant to take any action which might be seen as punishing people for things considered beyond their control, including the maltreatment of children.
I get that we don't want to be punitive. We don't want to stigmatize parents when it comes to very serious mental health issues or substance use disorders, but we can't lose track of the child that may be in that home. And as a community, as a society, as a country, we have an obligation to make sure that that child is safe.
Regardless of your opinion on these issues, the fact is that there are many children in situations of extreme instability and violence who need protection. Having an accurate count of these children and their circumstances is a key part of this vital mission.
The context for understanding the circumstances that contributed to deaths due to abuse and neglect are incredibly important because it helps us to shine a light on areas where changes in policy and practice might prevent those in the future. I've had colleagues describe child abuse and neglect deaths as kind of a canary in the coal mine. And I think that's pretty apt. I think that death is the most extreme kind of outcome we can observe. So it's not really about just focusing only on those final, most extreme events, but understanding the context and the conditions that led to those that are almost certainly affecting a much larger number of children.
Yet, even as researchers push for more reliable and widespread collection of this data regarding child maltreatment fatalities, they also acknowledge that this is simply one aspect of the larger need to help these children. The truth is that tackling this societal issue requires a societal effort, and researchers hope that by making this data easier to access and understand, they can also make it easier for the public to get involved.
I think the first step for all of us is to understand how common these incidents are, and really, and understand what the factors are behind the incidents, like what kind of maltreatment is happening here, and what is leading to it, not just, the failures of a particular agency. Because I think it's a failure of all of us. It's not just that particular caseworker or that particular law enforcement. I think there has to be a collective sense of responsibility here in order to fix the problem. But in order for people to feel that responsibility, I think they need to have a better sense of the scope and the specifics of the problem.
So what can the public do? In the immediate term, many of the largest issues with the data could be mitigated by greater transparency on the part of government agencies. We need accurate and systematic transparency of the circumstantial information surrounding these deaths. As we've seen, agencies have traditionally been hesitant to release too many specifics surrounding child maltreatment fatalities, citing privacy concerns. But a public push for more information, and thus more accountability concerning these deaths, could lead to a change in that calculus.
A death of a child is a really big deal. And if there is significant evidence of a history and a context that contributed to that death that the public is blind to and that we're not acting on, I think it creates harm. It leads to more cases that look exactly like the death that already occurred. So I understand that it's a balancing act, but I think that ultimately the benefits of transparency when children have died and a much greater release of information is important.
Will this kind of activism by itself end these deaths? Certainly not. But it's important to remember that things move in Washington because of advocates. Unfortunately, there is no natural cheerleader for these children. Therefore, we the people need to step up and be those advocates. But to demand better policy, we must first be informed by good data. Otherwise, we risk letting the media skew our understanding of the situation.
One of the reasons we overreact or potentially react so strongly is that the public's only understanding of how its child welfare system locally is operating is often when there is a media headline. I think that leads to bad policy as well. And I think that speaks a bit to the power of media coverage, because it means that we're allowing potentially atypical tragedies to define the narrative around what child welfare is or isn't doing, because that happens to be the one that the media does cover, and we're ignoring perhaps another set of fatalities that look very different, where the policy change or the investment or the practice changes would again be quite different. But because those never make it into the public domain, those changes don't occur. I think that often deaths occur that are symptomatic of other practices and policies that are affecting a much broader number of children who may not die, but are endangered. And when we don't know how many children are dying of abuse and neglect, we don't have a good way of assessing how we're doing in other areas of child safety.
This isn't to say that our current system needs to be thrown out entirely. Some states do have robust reporting mechanisms that deliver data with an impressive level of transparency and accountability. And a lot of good could be won just from adopting these standards and practices more broadly. But whatever shape the reform takes, when thousands of children are dying preventable deaths under our watch, it's clear that we have lost sight of what truly matters.
In so much of the media coverage, we don't even know the child's name. We just know that 2 adults were arrested, often for what is described as fairly egregious acts involving that deceased child, but we don't even honor and remember who that child was. And so they too quickly become just a number, just an unnamed child 2 months old. I think for there to be forward momentum, there needs to be a public push, a desire for more transparency, visibility, and accountability when it comes to these data and numbers. That's ultimately what's going to hopefully lead to some improvements in the collection of data in the years to come.